All right, I want to introduce my next interviewee. His name is Pedro da Costa. He has been covering economics and financial markets since 2001. He recently located to New York, from New York to Washington to cover the Federal Reserve and macroeconomic policy. He's earned a master's in international relations at the University of California, San Diego, and studied sociology and political science as an undergraduate at the University of Chicago and the London School of Economics. He is from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and so I want to thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, I'd always like to talk to the person. I want to know more about you. So how is it that you got into international relations? What prompted you to get into that?
Well, I sort of I had the blessing, I should say, of having gotten to travel a lot as a teenager. My father is a scientist, and I grew up in Brazil. My parents are both Brazilian. And when I was 13, we moved to the States because he was doing some work. And about 3 years later, we moved to Europe. And so I had, after basically between age 13 and age 17, I lived in like 4 different countries. So the international thing kind of came as a natural extension of that, and having to learn different languages and so on. So I said, okay, that's something that I should probably have a natural affinity for.
Right. Well, that's cool.
So that's how I ended up with that.
Okay, so you travel around Europe, but what about international relations? I mean, you said you told me earlier you were studying sociology. What piqued your interest about international relations, or were you sort of?
Sure. Yeah. So I was studying sociology mostly because you're an undergrad, you don't know what to major in. I was I figured it was some sort of liberal arts, social science thing that I was into.
Right.
And sociology seemed like an interesting, low-hanging fruit. Didn't require math, and then the more I did I liked what the early sort of old readings of sociology, like Weber and Durkheim. That's the sociology that interested me.
Same here. Yeah.
But when I got into modern day sociology, I found it very kind of pedantic and like quasi-scientific and overly statistical, and I found it kind of useless, to be honest.
Right.
And so I kind of diverted away from that and more towards a political science and even almost a political economy, study. And I was always a little bit intimidated by economics at first.
Right.
Which is why, it's kind of wonderful that I ended up doing what I did.
Okay, so you've done your undergraduate in international relations, and how did you end up at the London School of Economics? Did you meet Mick Jagger while you were there?
I didn't meet Mick, but the LSE was just an exchange program. It was a 1-year abroad program from UC. So,
okay.
So that's how that happened, and it was pretty amazing. It was pretty exciting to live in London at age 19 or whatever it was. So it's pretty fun.
Now, is that still like a sort of Fabian socialist type model there, or is it? What was that like in terms of
of their sort of philosophical leaning?
Yeah, right.
I didn't actually discern one. I took different enough classes that there wasn't like a cohesive ideology that they were trying to pitch, really. I took everything from nationalism to the sociology of Soviet society and a very kind of a pretty broad range of courses. So there wasn't an overarching kind of thinking that was being pushed upon you. I wasn't really intricately familiar with their economic thinking per se.
I see.
So
then how did you end up with Reuters?
So I stumbled into Reuters in the most kind of serendipitous of ways. I guess in the way that life guides you toward the things that you are supposed to do.
Yeah.
I just finished school and I moved to New York City, and I was skimping along working at this nonprofit. I didn't really like my job. I didn't really believe in the organization, and my roommate came home one night and he said, "Yeah, I met this guy at a party, and he worked for Reuters Data." and Pedro, you're a news guy. You should work for Reuters. And that's literally what happened. And so this random guy that he met at this party, I eventually met with him and had breakfast with him. He worked on the data side of Reuters. I applied for a job at Reuters Data as a data analyst, an entry-level data analyst. And I got the job. The job was in Connecticut. I was living in Chinatown at the time in New York City. And so the commute would have been about 2 hours each way. So I wasn't too excited about it. And so I wanted to find out whether the experience would at least lead me in the direction of editorial, which is the part of Reuters that I would have been interested in.
Right.
And so I spoke to an editor, and she told me that the experience would not at all be relevant, but that they also had a temporary news assistant position opening up there, that she'd be happy for me to apply. And so that's how I stumbled into it, knowing nothing about markets, having taken sort of cursory economics in graduate school, but just sort of basic macro, micro, basic accounting, stats, and so on, and finance, but not having really any experience of or understanding of markets whatsoever, and kind of being really thrown into the best possible school, which is, and just having to write it every single day and learning it from the inside. So
that's cool. Now, when you say that the data, so you're telling me that Reuters had an entire section dedicated to Brent Spiner from Star Trek? Is that what you're saying? I'm sorry. That was really stupid. I'm sorry. I like dumb jokes.
Yeah, something like that.
Anytime I hear data, I just immediately think Star Trek. Anyway,
I gotcha.
So okay, so then you've been doing this now for what, 10 years, covering economics, and
indeed.
I want to ask you. Let's go back. In terms of my studies of history, what we have, like in the Enlightenment, you have a move towards the individual. With Descartes' philosophy, for example, there's an emphasis on the individual's, own theory of knowledge, how the individual comes to know, which then, ends up prompting scientific revolution, all these things like that.
Sure.
And what you also see, from what I understand, economically, is a shift towards, the beginning of the idea of free markets and things like that, particularly after the French Revolution. And what I find really fascinating is the development of economics from that time up until now. And you mentioned Weber in a message to me, and I really liked the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, because I thought that he was really hitting on some of those same issues. And I mentioned to you Spangler, who gets into some of these same points as well. And do you think that, just your opinion, would you agree that there's a connection between maybe the shift in the worldview of people in that time, in terms of philosophy and religion and whatnot, to this idea of individualism, which then gives rise to the idea of a quote unquote completely free market, the laissez-faire idea?
I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but now that you put it that way, it definitely makes sense, because it is the same concept. It's the concept that, I think the free market laissez-faireism at its most extreme just kind of, it perverts the notion of individualism, because it takes the notion that, because individualism was a response to, of course, collectivism, right? And collectivism was basically living under either monarchic or feudal societies where, individual say was non-existent, and, there was no such thing as the concept of democracy. It's sort of a pre-French Revolution concept of political organization. And so individualism was a response to that. And so that's a wonderful thing, of course, that we all benefit from to this day. But I think where laissez-faire free market ideology, when taken to an extreme, does is it kind of creates it excuses amoral behavior by saying that simply by blindly pursuing one's own self-interest,
Yes.
one is doing what's best for society. I think that's it's a really difficult statement to argue
Absolutely.
if you look around the world.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That was a great analysis. I completely agree. Do you? So then, do you think that what we have now with movements like in the U.S. with like the Tea Party and that kind of stuff, sort of wanting to re-interject, if you will, these sort of older models, from the Enlightenment era, and I'm thinking of someone like Ron Paul, wanting to utilize a system that now, because of the complexity of modernity and globalization, things like that, won't really work. I mean, even though it might, in other words, it might be good at criticizing erroneous aspects or immoral aspects of the present system, like you're talking about. It doesn't really provide a workable, realistic solution to the complexities of the present situation.
I think that's one way to put it. I mean, the Tea Party, of course, is an amorphous blob of many different ideas,
Sure.
and Ron Paul, one among them. But I think that one of the things that the crisis lays bare is that laissez-faire is ultimately a philosophy of inaction. And so what you saw in the presidential debate last night was, it's kind of a bizarre phenomenon. It's all these public officials running for office, denigrating government at every possible juncture, and arguing that they're going to, curb government in every possible way. So it's kind of a bizarre twist, because
Right.
you would wonder why they would want to be public officials if they have such
Absolutely,
little
yeah.
faith in government. But what it also lays bare is the fact that it becomes harder to argue in the wake of a massive recession that followed a period of massive liberalization and deregulation and free market dominance. It becomes hard to argue that now, in the aftermath of the crisis that was caused by that framework, all we need is more of that framework.
Exactly.
And that's
Exactly.
what I'm hearing from that side. Not that the Democrats have many great alternatives.
Right.
By the way, the Democrats have proven themselves incredibly uncreative at devising their own sets of policies. In fact, all of their quasi policies kind of emulate Republican policies.
Right.
And so in this, so you'll get Larry Summers
Yes.
on Reuters the other day, I think it was yesterday, writing an op-ed arguing for, lo and behold, tax cuts, which is not exactly an innovative, creative idea that's going to have this sort of momentous and massive impact that's needed to deal with the problem of 14 million people without a job,
Yeah.
So they're
Well,
equally meek in their policy proposals, but they also adhere to the laissez-faireism, and the Obama administration's quandary comes from that. And I asked Austin Goolsbee this once when he was in the office, and he chuckled and he conceded that I had a point, but then he kind of proceeded to give the same line that he usually gives. And what I asked him was that the administration seems to be a disconnect in the administration's message,
Right.
in the sense that it claims that job creation is its number one priority, but almost in the same breath, it'll say government can't do anything to create jobs. It's up to the private sector. So
Right.
how are jobs your number one priority if there's nothing you can do about them? So
Absolutely.
that's kind of and so their response, of course, is that they want to create the environment for businesses that, to become willing to hire. But there doesn't seem to be any major creativity for something that's bold enough to have the impact that's needed.
Well, how are you wanting to create the environment for those things if you are for moving jobs overseas?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, that's one factor that's behind the decline in employment in this country. There's there's so many factors. There's the sending of jobs overseas. There's the erosion of bargaining rights for workers in this country. That has kept wages stagnant and has prevented wages from growing in line with productivity over the last 30 or so years. It's a trend that's widely documented. So that's the old story of the eroding purchasing power of the middle class in this country.
Absolutely. And I thought you made a really good point with that sort of flat-out contradiction in terms of the odd message that is sent when you are wanting to be in public office, and yet at the same time acting as if the problem is government itself. And that makes me wonder, well, how many times do we constantly seem to see the same dialectic pop up, the same problematic tension? And it makes me think of something like the removal of Glass-Steagall, for example. So if you have a completely free market, quote unquote, philosophy, and you want deregulation, but at the same time you're turning around and arguing that the problem is the quote bankers, right? Well, the removal of Glass-Steagall, the deregulation, did it not allow for the derivatives market to go crazy like it did? In other words, are you not again sort of affirming the very thing that you're denying?
Well, the issue of deregulation is an interesting one, because we are living in a moment where there's been an effort, a relatively meek effort, I would say, at addressing some of the issues that affected the crisis. Although I think many of the regulatory issues that led to the crisis have not been addressed, like fraud in the mortgage market, like proper rules for bank accounting that give clarity and transparency to bank balance sheets, which I'm a financial reporter. I have trouble figuring out what banks have what when. I've heard academics have a difficult time figuring out what's tier 1, what's tier 2. They can't even figure out what's capital. So you have a lack of transparency that's rampant, and that would not be allowed in any other industry. And you have even as we try to make a relatively moderate effort to address some of the issues that some of the failures that led to the crisis, some of the regulatory gaps, there's been a huge push, as from the financial industry against it. And so we're likely to not even see the relatively moderate amount of reform that that had actually made it into law, see it into its full way through the rulemaking process and actually have the desired effect. So and that was highlighted by the pressure itself was highlighted by Jamie Dimon's intense questioning, to use a polite term, of Chairman Bernanke on the issue of whether regulation was hampering job creation.
Right. Interesting.
Well,
I recently read some of what George Soros has written about problems in the present system, and his comments about wanting to end the dollar and things like that. And he made an interesting point about how you have a sort of flawed aspect to both a tightly controlled sort of socialist approach, as opposed to its opposite end of the dialectic, this completely supposedly free market. And he basically mentioned a sort of synthesis, a sort of third way. And so I was wondering what your assessment was, or opinion was, on the idea that some people have written books about a sort of third position, or a sort of synthesis, as if maybe this was kind of in the works all along.
That's one way to look at it. I have a slightly different way to look at it, which is like very results-based. Forget the ideology behind the idea. Show me concrete evidence. It's kind of a journalistic way of looking at it.
Right.
Show me concrete evidence of tangible results, and I will back your policy hands down. If you show me that the private sector can run the trash system better than the public sector can, boom, let's privatize it.
Yeah.
If you show me that, but at the same time, it needs to be proved. You can't blindly say that all things private will be better than all things public.
Sure.
And by the same token, you cannot say that all things centralized and controlled by government will be better than all things private. But it's impossible. I like to joke that, having worked for a giant corporation for a long time, I like to say that anyone who's worked in the private sector, anyone who says that the public sector is inefficient has never worked for a private corporation. Because if you look, especially at the executive level of major U.S. corporations, the amount of expenses that goes down, in terms of like basic travel for executives and, lavish dinners, events, etc.
Right.
It's just, it goes vastly beyond any waste that government could ever mount.
Right.
So.
Well.
And actually, to make another important point is that, you talked about the third way being the way between free markets and sort of a more social democratic model.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have to dissect each ideology for what it actually is trying to accomplish. So you have to take, the behavior of the parties involved into consideration. And what I mean by that is that I don't think we can talk about what the reigning model of U.S. capitalism as a free market model by any stretch of the imagination, because
that's true. Yeah.
You have a fundamentally, you have the most perverse form of socialism of all. You have socialism for financial institutions by the taxpayer.
Yes.
And so show me a real free market model.
Yeah.
It might actually work. I don't think that we should, as citizens, be averse. We should be so wedded to any ideology that we wouldn't be open-minded about accepting the idea that other policies work. Show me that
the practice over theory, right?
Show me that charter schools work. Maybe, like my instinct is that I'd like to see public education thrive. That's just maybe a natural bias of mine. But show me that private chartered schools work, and we should fund them. We should encourage them. We should look at policies that work, not be wedded to ideologies.
Right. Yeah. Praxis over just pure theory. Absolutely. But I completely agree. I wasn't trying to say that I thought that the U.S. actually really was a quote free market. I think I was saying, quote, that it's a purported free market.
Sure. No,
but you're absolutely right. It's a sort of receivership or cloaked quote free market that actually is run by more or less international interests. I would say. Is there an invisible hand that has guided us here, as Adam Smith said?
Is there an invisible hand that has guided us here? Maybe the invisible hand of God. There's and the confluence of economic events. I think that the big fallacy of economics is that it can predict the future.
Right.
Richard Fisher, who's president of the Dallas Fed, likes to quote, I forget who he's quoting, I think it might be Keynes. The good quotes are always Keynes, but he's got so many good ones. But it's something to the effect of economic forecasting was invented to make astrology look respectable. So I think the big fallacy of economics and even of market thinking is that anybody knows, anything about what's going to happen tomorrow or even an hour from now. So I think the predictive power of economics, the crisis has proven it to be very, very limited.
So the people that do, claim to have accurately predicted, were those just shots in the dark?
Well, there's a couple of cases where people can intelligently see trends that are getting out of hand. It's not that. It's not that there can be no foresight, but I just mean that, kind of the whole the whole investment business that's kind of based on the notion that if you only have enough charts in front of you, you can like kind of beat the market tick by tick,
Yeah.
is a really flawed one, and it fools a lot of people into losing money.
Well, in your piece, you kind of hint at the sort of backhand, backroom deals, shadowy type things going on, and that I want to ask you about. Greg Palast did a piece on Joseph Stiglitz in 2001, where he talked about the sort of planned implosion of companies, of nations, through the IMF and the World Bank. I want to know what your assessment of that was.
I think that sounds a little too conspiratorial for my taste. I mean, I've read Greg Palast stuff, and he's funny and fun to read, but that sounds a little too conspiratorial. I mean, I think that's an extreme way of saying that there were policies that some economists thought might be damaging to countries that were applied anyway because they were the IMF convention. I don't think it was as perverse as, I think there's a lot of decent people at the IMF despite the bad rep that it gets. If you look through the ranks, there's so many sort of career economists who are really trying to do the right thing. It's not like there's this cabal of people planning to destroy, the poor developing world. It's just that decisions are made with a certain kind of framework in mind that sometimes lead to perverse outcomes. And so, so I think in that sense.
Well, what about something like John Perkins' book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, where he sort of says, I was, a hitman who did this very thing that Joseph Stiglitz is talking about.
But by which you mean what exactly? Because I've read that book, and that I kind of browsed through that book, and it also sounded a bit conspiratorial to me. I mean, I can describe to you a little bit of what I saw in my story, and I think it's a much more passive.
No, it is. It is.
It's a much more passive and therefore much more pervasive sort of system of control. And it's not that it's ill-intentioned. It's just that it's apathetic to certain outcomes, and it ignores certain of its effects.
Well, some people. I'm sorry. No, you're good.
So in the story about the Fed and the story that ended up being titled Club Fed, the story was essentially it was based on having attended many years of economics conferences. Both myself and another colleague, Christina Cook, had often noticed that Fed officials would talk privately with, investors, hedge fund managers, and so on. And of course, they have to do that. It's part of their job to meet with these guys and get a sense from them of what the markets are thinking and what investors are thinking. But you always wondered, being as a reporter on, especially since you'd walk into a room and you hear the room hush because you're a reporter, but suddenly, like, if something that can't be said in front of you, why is it being said in front of somebody else? If it can't be said in front of a journalist, i.e., the public, then why is it being said behind closed doors?
Well, when I ask the question about it being planned, it's not that I necessarily am saying that the persons who have plan XYZ view it as nefarious or sort of subversive or something like that, but rather that in their estimation this would be a good plan for this underdeveloped country, but that it's not sort of engineered and planned is strange to me, given the fact that you have so many sort of open statements where people talk about it being that way. For example, if you read David Rockefeller's memoirs, he more or less says that. He says, this is the positions that I take, the actions that I take, are done, in what I believe to be the best interests of nations. And he says, I receive a lot of populist criticism but I'm doing what I think to be best. And so, the point being in chapter 27 of his book is that it is planned. So, and I'm not trying to be rude, but I do want to give you some sort of I don't want to just play softball. I want to give you some really
Oh no, absolutely. I understand. I see what you mean. I mean, all I'm saying is that I haven't, I'm in no position to assess whether that is true or not. That's all I have to say about it. Is
That's
that
cool. No problem.
in my experience, in my reporting, I haven't witnessed any nefarious planning of, aimed at kind of achieving perverse outcomes.
Well, again, I wasn't even making a moral assessment. I was just saying that from their perspective, it does appear to be something that is planned, not necessarily something morally destructive, or as if let's destroy the world or something. It's not something like that. In other words, it would be done from the perspective of, well, in the long run, this is something that will ultimately pan out and be beneficial.
Sure. I mean, the perfect example is the bailout of the banks, right?
Exactly.
That's
exactly.
obviously a planned action that was taken, ostensibly because otherwise the financial system would have melted down, or so we are told, and
right.
And yet it had many perverse consequences, which we're only beginning to deal with, such as too big to fail banks become even larger, and the financial safety net expanding, and so on. So in that sense, yes.
What do you think about the people who are predicting doom and gloom and a big economic collapse in the next few years, like a really big one?
Again, I think anybody who claims to see the future really doesn't know, and I think that it's easy also to, like, once you get in a gloomy mood, it's easy, like when we were in boom times, and I've been through a couple of economic cycles in my professional life enough to know that, like, you get caught up in whatever mindset you're in,
Right.
So I often have to catch myself to not be, like, excessively bearish, because
That's true.
You're kind of tainted to, like, recession, things are always going to get worse. And in the same way that you get caught off guard when things start getting worse when they were always getting better, you get caught off guard when they start getting better, and once when they're in the process of getting worse. So I don't know about, like, doom and gloom over the next, like, long-term horizon, but over the next 6 months, which is, I think, the most that you can ever try to even look out, it doesn't look good. Like, forecasts, people are downgrading their forecasts for growth. Employment seems to be stalling. It's not just the jobs report. We have jobless claims have been above 400,000 for several weeks.
Right.
Other the smaller job surveys, like small business surveys and other indicators, have been pointing to weakness. So that's pretty bad. At 2 years into a recovery, you're especially into a recovery from a deep recession, you're supposed to be getting like 5% growth and like 300,000 jobs a month, and we're nowhere near it. So it's not good.
Let me ask you this, and again, I don't mean to, this is not my field. I mean, I think you got really wise words here. So, I'm just trying to learn as I'm going here. What do you think about, for example, the Washington Post had on April 14, 2010, an article, "Politics Hampers the Effort to Reform the $450 trillion derivatives market." I guess what I'm wondering is, how could there be recovery given the fact that almost seems like something that is impossible to repay?
The notional value of the derivatives market? Yeah. Well, the derivatives market, there's something slightly deceptive about that figure, because it includes positions that offset one another, so that the actual amount that's outstanding, like once the bets are evened out, if that makes sense, is much smaller. It's still in the sort of single digit trillions, but it's not as massive as 400 trillion, or sometimes people talk about the $600 trillion derivatives market, depending on which securities you include. But nonetheless, it is a massive amount of. I mean, it doesn't mean that it's not debt that has to be repaid. There are contracts outstanding. What it means is that there's a lot of systemic risk in those markets, and that they're susceptible to potential losses that could lead to another crisis. So in that sense, that's preventing recovery. But if you want to talk about what's preventing recovery, to me, the single most important factor is a lack of creative policy ideas. And I go back to the point that I made earlier. Be they private sector or public sector, be it, a targeted tax cut for green jobs, sort of a free market kind of approach, or an outright WPA kind of program like they had in the Depression. It needs to be bold, and it needs to be commensurate with the problem, and neither side seems to be willing to go out on a limb and really take charge.
Will there be QE3?
You could get it, if things get bad enough, you could get it, but it's going to take at least another 6 months before they start really actively considering it, I think, because they would need to see not only a renewed rise in the unemployment rate, which we began to see in May, but it would need to be steady.
Mm-hmm.
So a worsening of the employment outlook, but also some sort of downtick in inflation, because when QE2, a very important point to keep in mind is that when QE2 was launched, inflation was so low and core inflation was so low that they were really worried about deflation. And that's something that central bankers fear, because it's something they have very few tools to fight, as opposed to inflation, which they can fight with rate hikes. And so they were able to make the case, even to inflation hawks, that inflation was too low, dangerously low. But now inflation is more it's not high, at least, not according to the readings they pay attention to. It's a whole nother discussion about what people actually feel the experience of inflation versus official inflation readings. But inflation, at least according to the metrics the Fed likes to look at, is not high, but it's also, they don't want it to get much higher. So it's harder to justify kind of opening up the monetary spigots at a time when inflation is kind of right where they want it to be. So you'd have to see unemployment rise and inflation come down further. So that takes a few months to filter through.
Gotcha. Well, and privately, you had messaged me with a few books talking about what you were reading. Tell us what are you reading recently?
Sure. Well, the most relevant one is Lords of Finance, which is actually recommended. I think Bernanke mentioned it during the 60 Minutes interview as one of the best books in the financial crisis that he had read. And so it made the rounds in the newsroom, and I've been reading it. It's a wonderful book about the central bankers that kind of ruled the financial world in the 20s, kind of as we teetered into the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Pretty fascinating how their policy mistakes kind of aggravated what was already a pretty nasty situation. So many similarities. I mean, amazing similarities.
Right. And who's the author of that?
I believe his name is Liaquat Ahmed, but I might be mispronouncing that. He's a former World Bank economist. Very good read. The other book I just picked up is King's General Theory.
Right.
Because I never read it, and I figured I really should,
Yeah. Well, that's cool. No, I appreciate that because
otherwise, I like to read Florida crime novels to keep my mind off of economics in my spare time, and because the life of a wire reporter is pretty mentally intense when you're in the office.
So you just have to sit there and just read the constant data stream all day? Is that what it is?
Oh my God! Not just the constant data stream, but there's at least 2 or 3 events that you got to be sort of associated with per day, and cover this speech and that speech, and write an analysis on the side, and work on your enterprise piece whenever you can. And I travel quite a bit to cover Fed officials, regional Fed officials, when they speak in different parts of the country. So keeps us busy.
Well, and now tell us about the award that you got doing reporting with Christina Cook and Emily Flitter. What was this the first big recognition that you got?
It sure was, man. It was a great honor. It was nice to know that somebody's paying attention.
Right.
And yeah, went to New York and had a little dinner.
Yeah, I did stand up in New York one time, and it went really good. I had a really good time there. I loved it.
You did what there?
I said I did stand up one time in New York.
Oh,
I
nice.
really enjoyed it.
So how often do you do that?
Well, actually, where I'm at now, doing grad school, there's not many venues here. I've done it a couple times locally, but you have to go to like Nashville or somewhere, which is like 2.5 hours from me. So I'm not able to do it
Like my DJ, man. I'm a DJ. That's my hobby, and
awesome.
since I moved to DC, there's nothing going on.
I have some friends that are involved in political stuff in DC, and they talk about not really enjoying the DC scene or whatever.
Yeah, it's a little slower. I lived in New York for a long time, but I was kind of ready to live a more sedentary life. New York is too crazy, so I don't mind.
Yeah, what kind of music do you do?
House music primarily.
Awesome. I love house, man. That's cool.
Chicago house.
Oh, that's the best, right? Yeah, I'm a big trance fan myself, but that's awesome. Cool. Well, I want to thank you, Pedro. This is a really fascinating discussion, I would think. Really appreciate you doing it, and maybe we can
I really enjoyed it too.
have you back sometime and get into some other issues. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, that'd be my pleasure, man.
All right, thank you.
All right, thanks, man.